Okay. Hello, everybody. Yes, hello, everybody. Good afternoon, or morning, good evening. My name is Thijs van der Plas, and I'm a graduate student working with Adam Peck and Andrew Saxon-Oxford and Tim Vogels at IST in Vienna. And I'm very excited today to host this week's speaker of the Neurotheory seminar, Valerio Mante. First I'll quickly explain how you can interact with the talk, how you can ask questions, and then I'll introduce the speaker. So for those of you who haven't used Crowdcast before, so there's a chat box on the right. You can use this to chat during the talk. And if you would like to ask a short question or a clarification during the talk, then please ask in the chat box, and I will interrupt Valerio and read these out. Alternatively, if you want to raise like a larger point of discussion for the end of the talk when we will hold a Q&A session, please ask your question using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can vote on other questions that other audience members have asked. And at the end, if you want to, I can invite you on the screen and you can discuss with Valerio directly. Alternatively, I'll read it out for you. And so I'll just say at the end of this talk, we will host an informal Zoom session for those of you who want to speak with Valerio, and I'll post a link to this at the end of the talk. So as I said, today's speaker is Valerio Mante, who is a group leader at ETH in Zurich and the University of Zurich. And he previously obtained his master's in physics and PhD in neuroscience from ETH in Zurich as well, where he worked with Matteo Canandini, studying the computational principles of the early visual system in mammals. And afterwards, he became a postdoc in Stanford, working with Bill Newsom, where he studied the neural processes underlying context-dependent behavior. And since 2013, he is now back in Zurich, starting his own lab, where he tries to understand the role of prefrontal cortex in normal and impaired cognition. And he's perhaps most famous for his 2013 Nature paper, and more recently a very exciting 2020 Nature paper on birdsong learning behavior. And I'm confident to say that I think his work has inspired many new scientists, including myself. So it's really my great pleasure to host him today. So Valerio, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Thijs, for the introduction. And thanks for the invitation to present our work here. So let's see if I can share my screen. Okay, so I guess you can see my slides and you can hear me. So the general goal or the general topic of my presentation will be to try to address a problem that I guess is key to systems neuroscience, and that I think probably many of you are also thinking about. And that's the question of, if you're given some recordings from a large population of neurons during some task, right? For example, this could be monkeys performing some decision-making task. So in this case, these are recordings from a Utah array in prefrontal cortex from about 200 neurons, right? So if you get these kind of recordings, what can you learn? What can you infer about the computations that the underlying populations are implementing, right? So how are they contributing to the task, to the behavior, let's say, this monkey is performing? And as you also know, there are many ways that we can try to address this question. And even in my lab, we use a number of approaches to look at the very same data that we're presenting today. And so, this is an incomplete list of things that one could do, right? We could look at selectivity of single neurons. We could look at selectivity at the level of population, looking at encoding, decoding of task variables. We can look at phenomena like synchrony oscillations, look for cell assemblies, clusters of neurons, or more generally look at the topology of the responses, or do more model-based approaches based, say, on dynamical systems. And any one of these approaches that we could take takes a somewhat different view on what is important. What are the features of the responses that we should focus on? And I guess it's an interesting question for the field, right? How all of these approaches relate to each other, which I'm not going to go into though in my talk. Now, of the things that we do, I'm going to focus on one of these approaches. I want to mention another one before I get into the talk, and it's related to this paper that Thijs mentioned, right, where we essentially develop methods to study and infer the topology of high-dimensional data. And so these are methods that we originally developed to analyze birdsong vocalizations. So these were recordings from zebra finches over the many months. So these are very large, very high-dimensional data sets. And so the methods that we developed are based on so-called nearest neighbor statistics, and they allowed us to, infer structure in this data that was not apparent before. But what is nice about these methods, and the reason I'm mentioning them here, is that they're really very general. And so they're a way to extract structure, and in particular, temporal structure in high-dimensional data, not just in this vocalization, but generally in any data. And so we have started using them also on neural responses. And so I think this could be interesting also for some of you. So, you can look at the science and the code in these papers. But today I'll focus on a very different set of approaches, which, unlike these other methods, which are not model-based, here we're going to take very much a model-based approach. We're going to make some very strong assumptions about the nature of the computations that are being implemented by populations of neurons and how we should best study them. And so that's the approach based on dynamical systems. And so this is an approach that has been around for a while. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Here's just one recent review from the Chenoy and Susilo groups. And so one aspect of this framework, I guess, that I want to emphasize is that over the last years, there have now been a number of examples where people have taken artificial neural networks and trained them to solve some task that, say, monkeys also solved. And there is this, often this surprising similarity in the kind of dynamics of responses observed in such a recurrent neural network and responses observed in populations of neurons in the brain. At least, for some areas like prefrontal, motor areas. But these are, the tasks still can be quite different, right? So the idea is you take some inputs, you feed them into a recurrent neural network that is initially, say, randomly initialized, its connections, and then you train it to produce some outputs. And the inputs could be anything, right? Could be, say, some stimulus properties, the color or motion of a stimulus in the case of a, say, discrimination task. Could be some contextual information, could be a movement goal, some desired time interval in timing tasks or a goal queue. And then again, the outputs could be many things, right? The choice, a movement, the timing of a movement, maybe some EMGs, muscle contractions that were recorded, or some other control signals. And what is interesting is one finding that we can now look, right, at what kind of computations are implemented by these networks across these different tasks. And it turns out that a somewhat similar set of concepts seems to work in explaining the computations. And so I'll show you this more concretely in an example just in the next slide. But essentially, this is the framework that we're going to take, right? We're going to try to look at neural responses based on the lens of what we learned from these kind of networks. And so as a first step, we're going to now transform our data, like these recordings here on the left, into a framework that makes it comparable to what we look at in neural responses in these artificial neural networks. So these actually are the last action potentials you see in this talk, also the last single units. So because what we're going to do right from the beginning, we're going to start binning action potentials in bins of maybe 50 milliseconds to obtain firing rates. And then we're going to look at these firing rates in terms of a population pattern, right? This is just a vector, say, in a two-dimensional state space, if we have 200 neurons. And we're going to use dimensionality reduction techniques to then look at these responses. So here is an example of such an analysis. So this is data from prefrontal cortex in a task where monkeys were doing a contextual discrimination task, right? So they were either discriminating the motion or the color of a random dots pattern and then indicating the choice with a saccade to one of two targets. So this is the work that Thijs mentioned. And what we're looking at here now are population responses, right? So each point is, or each trajectory first, is a trial averaged response of the population for trials that fall into one particular condition, right? So in here we see 6 conditions which are determined by the choice that the monkey made, so choice to the right or choice to the left, and they're determined by the strength of the motion signal, right? Whether the motion was strong, intermediate, or weak. And we're looking at a particular two-dimensional projection of the full state space. So this corresponds to the modulation then of 2 patterns of activity. And these are 2 special patterns that we chose because one of them, this vertical pattern, is modulated primarily by the strength and the direction of the motion signal. And this other horizontal direction is modulated by the choice that the monkey made. And I'm not really going to go much into the details of what we learned from this type of trajectories, but the main thing I want to emphasize is that you can now take one of these recurrent neural networks that was trained to solve the same task as the monkeys. You can look at the population responses in the same way, and you get, at least qualitatively, a match to the kind of responses that we saw in prefrontal cortex. And in fact, the responses that one sees in these networks, can explain some of the surprising features that we had observed and couldn't really make sense of beforehand. Now, what is interesting then about these networks, if you can reverse engineer them, we can understand how they're actually computing what they're computing. And so there are essentially 2 ingredients, 2 components that drive the responses, right? One is the recurrent dynamics, right? So which I'm going to indicate with these flow fields. So each arrow here tells you how activity would evolve from one particular state, right? One pattern of activity in this space from one time step to the next, right? So this is what one arrow shows. This in the absence of an input, okay? This is just the internal dynamics of the network. And in this case, these networks, the activity falls towards this line, which is a line attractor. And instead, inputs then, like the motion input, injects another pattern of activity, so it also pushes activity along one specific direction. And it's in the interaction of these inputs with the recurrent dynamics that generates these responses, right, and these trajectories. And, it is in this interaction that also generates ultimately the variables that this network needs to compute to generate the output, in this case, the choice, right? And this variable that needs to be computed, in this case, is the accumulated evidence towards one choice or the other, and is represented essentially by movement along this line attractor. Now, this is just one example of one of these networks, but this general idea that you can explain the computations in these networks as this combination, this interaction of an input with the recurrent dynamics, and these two together lead to the computation of latent variables that you can then read out to generate your output. This is this general idea that works really to explain many computations in these recurrent neural networks. And so this is the framework that we're going to take also to try to analyze then the neural responses, right? We're going to assume that this is the way that we should understand computations in the neural population. And so the comparison that I like to make is that if you think about computation in single neurons, right, the very useful concept is the receptive field of the neuron, right? The receptive field just describes how inputs into this neuron are transformed into responses at the single neuron level. And so likewise, you can now think of this recurrent dynamics as the equivalent of the receptive field, but at the level of the population, right? It describes how inputs into this population are transformed into the responses of the population. And so both of these are models, right? So these are abstractions. They don't necessarily say anything about the implementation. So even though here I'm calling this recurrent dynamics, which is the way these flow fields are implemented in a recurrent neural network, in principle, maybe I should call this, would be better call this internal dynamics, right? This, in principle, in neural populations would also be implemented by other mechanisms, say intrinsic mechanisms to the cell, but the basic framework might still apply. So, once you take this standpoint, right, that we can understand computations at the level of population in this way, then it becomes pretty clear that one goal that we should try to pursue is to estimate the recurrent dynamics or the internal dynamics based on population responses that we measure. And this is the goal that we're going to pursue in this talk. Now, I want to mention that even if you don't believe, if you haven't bought into this hypothesis, right, this idea that you can think of computations in this way, I believe that still the kind of estimates of dynamics that I will present will be very useful to test this whole framework more rigorously, right? Because it will lead to very precise predictions that can then be tested experimentally. Okay, so here's the plan. So first, I'm going to show you simulations from some simple models of decision responses. And I'll use these to illustrate some major challenges in estimating recurrent dynamics. And in fact, one of the conclusions from this will be that it's generally not possible to obtain unique solutions, unique estimates for what the recurrent dynamics is based on recordings of responses alone. But then I'll show our approach to estimating dynamics, which is residual population dynamics, which might be somehow the best you can do, as good as it gets in terms of estimating recurrent dynamics. Then we'll apply this approach of estimating residual dynamics to responses in prefrontal cortex during decision-making and movement generation. And hopefully I'll have time to also describe then in the end some more realistic models, beyond what I'll show you here in the beginning, but specifically models where you have two areas, two recurrent networks that are interacting with each other, and try to understand what that means, how we should interpret residual population dynamics in maybe more realistic settings like the ones we would encounter in the brain. And then I'll summarize. Okay, so here is one particular model that has been proposed to underlie decision responses in areas like prefrontal cortex. So this comes from the work of Zhaojing Wang. You can think of this as the output of a recurrent neural network. In practice, though, what we're doing here, we're really just simulating a two-dimensional dynamical system, right? And so you're actually seeing the entirety of the model. And what is plotted here are the recurrent dynamics, right? So this is how the responses evolve in this network or in this dynamical system in the absence of inputs. And what is being implemented here, you can see, is a saddle point in the middle, right? So this is an unstable fixed point, so you tend to fall either to one side or the other. So this is kind of the uncommitted state that the network is in before a decision, and then the decision process is reflected by either falling to one side or the other. And then the choice essentially is implemented by these two fixed points, okay? Now, we can feed an input into this network. And the input I'm representing down here in terms of its projection onto these two dimensions. So in this case, this input has a positive projection onto dimension 1, a negative one onto dimension 2. So it means it's pointing down to the right in this subspace. And in this case, it's constant across time. And now if you drive this network with this input, it will generate trajectories. So we also inject noise. And in gray here, you see single trials. And then in blue, this is now a trial average trajectory for all trials that led to a choice 1, right, that went to this side. And we can change the direction of the input, now make it point up and to the left, and then you will get trajectories that go to the other side. And now one first basic observation, which you might already have noticed on one of the previous slides, is actually the trajectories that you see here, they don't really follow the recurrent dynamics, right, these flow fields. And that's just because the recurrent dynamics is not the only contribution to the responses. There's also the input, which pushes it. And so it's the combination of the two that determines this trajectory. But one, trivial consequence of this, which though is really problematic when you want to estimate dynamics, is that we can now take another model, right, that implements a very different computation, right, a very different recurrent dynamics. In this case, this is a line attractor dynamics, right, of the kind that we had found in our networks with this non-normal dynamics, right? So the activity falls towards the line attractor, not orthogonally, but obliquely. But so even though the recurrent dynamics is very different than over here, we can choose an input in such a way that at least at the level of the conditional average trajectories, this blue and red trajectory, these two models are indistinguishable, okay? And we can use yet another model that is yet different, right? This one just implements a point attractor. And again, we can choose some inputs, which in these two cases need to be time dependent, such that the average trajectory looks exactly the same across all three models. And you probably realize that this is an issue, right? So if much of what we do when we try to estimate the dynamics of a network or a population of neurons is to look at such condition average trajectories. And really, the problem is that most of the time we don't know what the input into these areas are. And so we can't really then say what the recurrent dynamics was. So this is the, why, or one of the reasons why estimating recurrent dynamics is difficult. We usually don't know what the inputs are. And so I'll show you now how we try to at least, even if we cannot estimate recurrent dynamics completely, we can nonetheless try to distinguish between these models based on the responses. And so what I'll do is I'll zoom in here on one particular region of state space. And so what we're seeing here is now, again, the conditional average trajectory and then some example trials. And so here is just one trial and, the activity at time t1 and activity at time t2 for this trial, and the same here on the conditional average trajectory. And now I would say mostly when one tries to estimate dynamics, this is what we try to estimate, right? How the state of the network, the activity at time t1, is transformed into activity at times t2. But again, the problem is that we try to estimate this, we will also be picking up a lot of the effect of the input. And so we take a different approach. So we're going to look at just what we call the residuals, right? So the residual at time t1 is just the difference between the activity on that trial at t1 and the average activity at that time. And for t2, the same, it's this vector. And we're now essentially going to ask not how the state itself evolves, but how these residuals evolve. So if we move this arrow over here, essentially this difference is what we're going to call the residual dynamics, okay? And you can think of this as telling you how a perturbation of the activity away from the conditional average trajectory will evolve in the next time step. And it turns out, as I'll show you in a second, that this contains a lot of information that allows you to distinguish between these models. And I want to emphasize that this idea of looking at residuals, right, to understand something about computations is not a new idea. There is a very long and rich literature on this. What we will be doing somewhat differently here is that we really try to get a complete description of the dynamics of the residual that will tie more closely then to the computations that the underlying networks implement. Okay, so in this case, for these models, we don't actually have to estimate the residual dynamics, right? These are just dynamical systems that we can write down in an equation, so we can just analytically derive what the residual dynamics is. And this is what I'm showing you here. So again, now each arrow tells you if you had perturbed the activity to a particular location in the state space, how the residuals would evolve from that location. And for example, here you can see for the saddle point model at this location, if we perturb activity along the horizontal direction, these perturbations will grow, right, from one timestamp to the next. But if we perturb along the vertical direction, the perturbation will contract, okay? For the line attractor case, you see a perturbation along the horizontal direction persist, right? They essentially stay the same, and along other directions, they contract. And then for the point attractor, they contract along all directions. And the key thing to notice here is that this residual dynamics differs strongly between these computations, okay? Even though these average trajectories look identical, the way that perturbations relax around them is very different. And at least in these models that I'm showing you here, it turns out that the residual dynamics only reflects the recurrent dynamics and not the inputs, not at all. So this is not generally true. It is true under some assumptions that I will come back to towards the end of the talk. But certainly for many of the models that many of you have probably simulated, these assumptions will hold. Now, you can also see that this is not exactly the recurrent dynamics, right? So if you look at this flow field, and if you remember before, this was the saddle point model, and this is the starting point of this trajectory, right? This is where the actual saddle point is in the recurrent dynamics, whereas the residual dynamics, now the saddle point is at the location on the trajectory where we're computing the residuals. That's just by definition of how we define residuals. This always has to be the case, that the fixed point of the dynamics is here at the location on the trajectory where we're computing the residuals, right? So at the origin here. And this has the advantage that we can actually fit now the residual dynamics with a linear dynamical system, okay, without any inputs. And now concretely, in practice, right, for here we don't have to estimate the dynamics, or we can just write it down. In practice, though, when we do this with neural responses, we'll have to estimate it. And this will essentially come down to trying to estimate the relationship between the covariance of the residuals at one time and the covariance of the residuals at the next time. And from these relationships, we can estimate the residual dynamics. I won't tell you in detail how we're going to do this. I'm happy to discuss this after the talk in the Q&A session. There are essentially two steps involved in this. One is a subspace identification step, where we try to find a subspace of the full state space that contains meaningful dynamics, meaning where where residuals at the next time can be predicted by residuals at the previous time to some extent. And then once we have identified the subspace, we use a method called instrumental variable regression to estimate the residual dynamics. Okay, now also, for these two-dimensional dynamical systems, it's convenient to look at these phase portraits. In practice, though, we'll estimate dynamical systems that are larger than 2 dimensions. So looking at flow fields is not so useful anymore. So we're going to extract some important features from these portraits, or from the fits, right, of the linear dynamical systems that we're going to perform. And this is now what we're doing here, right? So now we're going to simulate responses from these models with noise and so on. We're going to compute residuals, use the methods that I described before, and actually estimate the residual dynamics. In this case, if we do it at this time, and we look at the eigenvalues of the dynamics, we will find one eigenvalue larger than one and one smaller one. right? So this corresponds to the unstable direction. So this eigenvalue larger one, and then the vertical direction corresponds to an eigenvalue smaller one. For the line attractor, we get one eigenvalue close to 1, right? That's the line attractor direction, and then one smaller one, that's the contracting direction. And for the point attractor, we get 2 eigenvalues smaller one. And now we're just going to repeat this at different times, right? So we will only consider trials from a particular condition at a particular time. We estimate this as residual dynamics, and now we repeat this at a different time, which essentially means at a different location in state space, right, along the trajectory. And so if we repeat it at this time here, you can see now we're kind of getting, in this model, we're getting out of the influence of the saddle point. So now the largest eigenvalue is only 1. For the line attractor, it's still the same, and for the point attractor also, it hasn't changed from the previous time. We're just going to repeat this for every time, and this is what we get. Okay, so now we're going to get, again, we're estimating a linear dynamical system at each time point, and time really is parameterizing the position along the condition average trajectory, right? And we're going to, again, estimate different dynamical systems along different trajectories. And so this is, even though we're estimating only linear dynamics locally, you can still capture very nonlinear behaviors because we are computing these different local approximations along the trajectories. And so in this case, you can again see right at the beginning, when you're still close to the influence of the saddle point, you see this instability, and then as we move away, we see the effect of the fixed points. So yes, the thing that we're going to be looking for, right? So we can now read out whether we are in a region where there is an actual instability. We can read out whether we're close to something like a line attractor where we have persistent activity, or if we are mostly in the influence of just a stable fixed point. Now, there are more things we can read out from the residual dynamics. For example, we can look at singular values instead of eigenvalues. And if you see, if I go back here, you can see that the singular values are somewhat different for this particular model. And this is now a manifestation of so-called non-normal dynamics, which some of you care about. It's an important part of a number of models of computations in recurrent neural networks that have been proposed. And so it's definitely something that one would like to be able to estimate from neural recordings. And in this particular model, this relaxation is non-normal, and what that amounts to is a so-called transient amplification, right? So that on short time scales, the perturbations away from the trajectory are amplified, at least along one direction, even though on long time scales, the activity is just persistent. Okay, so this is the approach that we're going to take, right? Estimating these residual dynamics. And we're now going to apply this to responses in prefrontal cortex. So the recordings, as I mentioned already before, are obtained with a UT array that was implanted in a part of prefrontal cortex, which is called the pre-arcuate cortex. It's close to the frontal eye fields. So we have 96 channels, so we get maybe about 150 to 200 single-end multi-units per session. And the task that the monkey was performing is just a variant of the random dots direction discrimination task. So the monkey sees some dots while he's fixating. Then the dots disappear, and the monkey, when the fixation point disappears, has to make a saccade to one of two targets to indicate the choice. And if we look at neural trajectories, using appropriate projections, you see what we had seen also in these models, right? So during the decision period, you see this movement from some uncommitted state to either a state corresponding to a choice 1 and another state corresponding to choice 2. And if you look now also at the movement period, you can do, for example, an analysis like JPCA, right, which tries to extract rotational activity. And sure enough, we see a very nice, strong rotational activity around the time of the saccade, right? So the rotation starts sometimes before the saccade and onset, and then continue until some time after. But now, as I, hopefully convince you, it's not clear what we should learn from these conditional average trajectory, right? There are a number of models that are consistent with them, and so we're going to look at the residual dynamics to see what more we can learn about the underlying computations. And this is now how this looks like. So these are the same plots that I showed you before for these simple models. So we're looking at the eigenvalues of the residual dynamics that we estimated at one particular time during the trial. And here we're looking at the time part of the trial that starts from the dot's onset and ends with the dot's offset. So this is essentially the decision period where the monkey is making up his mind about what he's going to choose. And then we have a second epoch that is aligned to the saccade, where he's going to, when the monkey chooses one option or the other. And in this particular monkey, but this is really similar across all monkeys, we estimated a 6-dimensional dynamic subspace, okay? And so this subspace is, closely aligned, is overlapping with, say, the subspace that you would have gotten if you look at maybe the first 10 principal components of the conditional average responses. And so we have a 6-dimensional subspace. So at each time, we're going to estimate 6-dimensional dynamics. And so we get 6 eigenvectors and eigenvalues. And that's what we're plotting here. And what do we learn? Well, during the decision period, really, all of these eigenvalues are smaller than 1, right? So this is actually the monkey that shows the largest eigenvalues that are reached just transiently. They're just below 1. But by and large, all the eigenvalues that we observe are stable. And so that rules out some of the models that I presented to you, which would have been consistent with the condition average responses.
Sorry, can I ask? So is each trace one monkey or one eigenvalue for one monkey?
Each trace is one eigenvalue.
I see. Okay.
You cannot always see 6 traces because in some cases you have complex eigenvalues, and then you have 2 eigenvalues that are on top of each other.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Yes, you'll see this in a second. Actually, I'll show you the imaginary part of these eigenvalues, or rather the angle between the imaginary and the real part, which is going to tell us something about rotational dynamics.
Okay.
Yeah. So over here, by the way, you see time, this eigenvalue transforming into a time constant, right? So as the eigenvalue gets closer to 1, the time constants get longer and longer. So this clearly is slow dynamics, right? We're talking about time constants that can be up to, say, 800 milliseconds. But nonetheless, it is always stable. We can look at the singular values, right, and try to find any evidence of non-normal dynamics. And sure enough, there seems to be some evidence. So the largest singular value you can see is substantially larger than the largest eigenvalue. We don't, this is a form of transient amplification, even though it's not really, there is no amplification per se, right? Even the largest singular value is not larger than 1. So we call this transient persistence, right? And what this means is that somehow, again, on short time scales, perturbations along the average trajectories tend to hang out a bit longer, hang around a bit longer than you would expect by the long-term dynamics, right? That is captured by the eigenvalues. But the interesting thing is that we can now get evidence for these non-normal dynamics directly from the data. And also, we can look at something that I didn't show you before, which is, as I said, the angle between the imaginary part of these eigen values and the real part. And what you can see is that there's typically one complex eigenplane, right? So a plane in state space within there is rotational dynamics. And this is true also during this decision period, okay? And the frequencies involved are about 0.5 to 1 hertz in this case. Now, what is interesting also is that you can now see quite big differences across time, right? So there's not much temporal dynamics during the decision period, but there's a big change in the dynamics at the time of the saccade, right? So there's this contraction in the eigenvalues that we observe. And this shows why it's so important, right, to estimate dynamics that are time dependent or dependent on the position in state space. And so again, what does this mean, right? So as I already mentioned, right, so we can now exclude, thanks to these measurements, a number of models that would have been consistent with the trajectories that we observe in terms of condition averages, right? So models that involve an instability are not consistent with the residual dynamics that we observe. Interestingly, this is something that was found also in mice. So this is a paper by the Svoboda lab where they used optogenetic perturbations. They also found that the area of frontal cortex that they looked at was actually not implementing any unstable or was implementing stable dynamics. And one possibility is that it might mean that the decision really is computed upstream, right? That's something that would be consistent with that. If we look at the movement period, as I mentioned, we see these very nice rotations in the condition averages. But when we look at the residual dynamics, so there is one complex eigenplane that we find, but usually what happens is that the planes of rotation do not really match, right? So there are some planes within which we see very nice rotations in the condition averages where there is no equivalent rotation at the level of the residuals, which is not consistent with rotational dynamics, as one would think about it. Just a flow field that essentially is causing the trajectories to move the way they do. And also the frequencies do not match, right? If you measure the frequency of rotation in the condition averages, it does not match the frequency that we observe in the residuals. And maybe the biggest problem is that the eigenvalues also don't match, right? So to explain these kind of nice rotations, you would need eigenvalues close to 1 or even a bit larger than 1, whereas what we see are eigenvalues much smaller than 1, right? So that would cause a spiraling just down to 0. So again, there's some evidence for similar effects obtained with optogenetic perturbations, again, in mice. And they kind of suggest, or at least would be consistent with at least part of this rotational dynamics that we see in the condition averages really being driven mostly by an external input. And a final point that I want to make is that we can also look at neural variability. So we can compute measures like a Fano factor, which is computed at the level of single neurons, right, and an average across single neurons. That what we see is something that others had observed before, which is this quenching of variability right after the dots onset. Okay, so the variability is reduced transiently after the dots come on. It's also reduced transiently even more strongly around the time of the saccade. But what is interesting now is that so this quenching of variability was interpreted or could be an indication that the dynamics itself is becoming more fast, more quickly contracting. And we see that happening around the time of the saccade, right? But we don't see it happening around the time of the dots presentation. And so there must be some other explanation for this reduction in variability. And one possibility is a reduction in the amount of noise of variability that is actually injected in this network, but not in the dynamics itself. And so generally, so we can disentangle the variability from the actual dynamics. Now, this is obviously all these conclusions that I drew here. These are hold for this particular monkeys in this particular area in these tasks, right? This need not be true generally. And sure enough, we've started looking at residual dynamics in other areas during other tasks. So this is from area M1 during a reaching task. So this is activity aligned to the reach start. And you can see substantial differences in the residual dynamics, even though at the level of the condition averages, these are actually quite similar, the responses in M1 and in PFC. So we see more evidence for stable and really persistent activity in M1. We also see evidence of transient amplification, and we see actually stronger rotations at the level of the residuals. Okay, so this conclusion that I drew for PFC, that the rotational dynamics that we see, for example, in the condition averages, cannot be explained by internal dynamics, right? Because we don't see it in the residuals. This need not be true in an area like M1, right, where there might be a better consistency between the internal dynamics and what we see in the condition averages. But another interesting point, right, that this is making is that we can use residual dynamics to really find differences between areas that might not be apparent at the level of the condition averages. Right, and we also see no contraction in the eigenvalues at the time of the movement. Okay, so I'm running a bit short on time, but let's see. I'm going to try to give you at least the punchline as to what happens in more realistic models. Okay, so the basic picture that I drew in the beginning, right, was one recurrent neural network that receives some external input and that we're going to then read some output from. Okay, and the idea is we're recording some subset of the neurons in this recurrent network. But I mentioned that there is a basic assumption that needs to hold, such that the residual dynamics only reflects the recurrent dynamics and not the external input. And so if this external input is this bi of t, where I would be, say, a trial and t is time, that assumption is written down here. So we assume essentially that the input on any given trial is given by some time-dependent component that is fixed across all trials of that condition, right? So it can depend on the condition, it can depend on time, but within a condition, the variability that is added at each time, at each trial, is just drawn from independent samples from some distribution. It doesn't need to be a normal distribution, but the critical thing is that the noise itself, the variability around this average input is uncorrelated across time. Right, and so this makes intuitive sense, right? If the input itself has some long correlations, right, then this will be picked up by the residual dynamics, right? This leads to some correlation at the residuals from one time to the next. So now there are two ways about this. You can say, well, yeah, our measure of residual dynamics just accounts for anything that is recurrent dynamics, right? We're going to define the input as everything that doesn't have a correlation across time, but maybe that's not so satisfying. So, because in general, this assumption will not hold, right? So if we imagine that we're recording from this area over here, which is now receiving an input itself from another recurrent network that is receiving these external inputs, these external inputs will already be filtered through these first networks, and by the time they're fed into the second network, which is the one that say we're recording from, there will be temporal correlations added to the input, right? And so what we estimate in terms of residual dynamics from the activity in this network will also reflect some of the computations performed in this first network. And things are going to get even worse, presumably, when we connect these two networks recurrently with each other. And so there's a question then, can we still somehow distinguish these two cases based on the measures that these residual dynamics that I presented, or is this just all hopeless? And so we looked at this using simulations now from a more realistic model, which also comes from Xiaojing Wang's lab, which essentially involves two networks now, right? One that they call PPC, right, parietal cortex, and one that is a PFC. And so the external sensory inputs are fed into PPC, and then there are recurrent connections within these areas and across these areas. And so we can essentially play with this network and have situations that look more like this, right, where you just have a feed-forward connection between these two areas, and one where you have feedback connections, then play with the strength of these connections. And one basic result is what is shown here. Here is a case where we have strong recurrent connection within an area and a weak feed-forward connection. And here's a case where we have weak connections within the area, but strong recurrent connections between the areas. And if we now estimate eigenvalues, right, based on the recurrent dynamic, on the residual dynamics, right, that we estimated from these simulations separately in PPC and PFC, we see that qualitatively, for both areas, the eigenvalues are quite similar in these networks. Okay, so this time here, this dashed line shows when the external input is provided. And so we're running these here in a regime in both cases where there is an actual instability, right? So these are, they implement, these networks at some level implement an instability, which is not what we find in our data, but nonetheless, right, this is something that one could encounter, right? We could have found responses like this, and essentially these simulations are showing that if we get something that looks like this, we wouldn't be able to distinguish between these two cases, which is somewhat depressing. Well, I guess I'm gonna skip this. Essentially, what this is just showing, we're just exploring here, different levels of the strength of inter-areal connections and different strength of the intra-area connections, right? So the self-connectivity, both in the feed-forward case and in the feedback case. And the basic result, again, is that especially when you have feedback between the areas, right, you can essentially trade the strength of the connections, recurrent connections within an area, and the strength of the connections across the areas, and essentially, get very similar dynamics at the level of these eigenvalues. Which means, one conclusion from this is that really the residual dynamics that we estimate, right, we cannot really say that it corresponds to the local recurrent dynamics, right? It will reflect recurrent dynamics across a network of strongly recurrently connected areas. And this is in a way not so surprising, right? It's also not so different from the idea of if you go back to the example of the receptive field, right? If you measure receptive field in V1, you don't really know what the contributions are from LGN, from V1 itself, and feedback from other areas, right? But nonetheless, measuring these receptive fields and comparing it across different areas can provide insights into computations. And that seems to be the case also for the residual dynamics based on this comparison between PFC and M1. But still, this is a bit discouraging, but nonetheless, I want to tell you that there is something very encouraging that came out of these simulations, and I'm just going to tell you this quickly. So what we can do is we can do things differently. We can, instead of, if we assume that we have recordings now from both areas, from both PPC and PFC, and then estimate, we just pool this data and we compute one single residual dynamics. So in this case, we would estimate 3 eigenvalues. Again, there is no difference, or qualitatively, not much difference in the eigenvalues that we would estimate from this global dynamics in these two scenarios. But it does turn out that, and I'm not going to really explain this, I'm just going to tell you because I'm out of time. There are now.
We have some more time. That's fine.
We have time? Sorry, what did you say? That we have some more time?
Yeah, we have some more time. Yeah.
Okay, so then I'll actually explain this. So what you see here, right? So we estimate 3 eigenvalues in both cases from this global dynamics, right? And if I go back, you can see just based on the values that they have, you can think that maybe this eigenvalue is somewhat common to PPC and PFC. This one, right, looks more like the PPC mode, and this one might then more look like a PFC mode. But again, you see both, all 3 of them in a way across these 2 scenarios. But it turns out that we can look at a finer structure of these residual dynamics. And in particular, we can look at how these the eigenvectors corresponding to these eigenmodes, how they're aligned with particular modes within PPC and PFC. And in this particular model, they're really just 2-dimensional. These are 2-dimensional dynamics that are implemented either within PPC or either within PFC. And so you can think of a difference mode, right, where you have a population that codes for right and left. And this is the mode that differentiates the 2. So this would be kind of a choice direction. And then you have a sum mode, which represent, co-activation of these different pools within PPC. This would be what one would interpret as condition-independent variance, or if you do something like DPCA. And we can now look at how, these modes, again, that we estimate globally from PPC and PFC align with these difference and sum modes in PFC and in PPC. And sure enough, you can see that the first mode, so this is now the case of just feed-forward connections between PPC and PFC. The first mode has a small angle, meaning aligns mostly with the PPC difference mode. It has a large angle but aligns a little bit with the PFC difference mode, where it has, it's essentially orthogonal to the sum mode. The second mode, sure enough, as we had already concluded from just looking at eigenvalue, aligns only with PPC and only with the PPC sum mode. And then the third mode aligns very little with the sum and PPC difference mode in PPC, and mostly aligns with the difference mode in PFC. But now critically, right, if we take these first, second, and third mode that we obtain in the case of the strong recurrent connections between these areas, we see differences, right? So now this slow mode becomes more of a shared mode, right? So it means that it's still aligned with the difference mode in PPC, but a bit less. But it is now more aligned with the difference mode in PFC, right? So these modes kind of move towards 45 degrees, which would be really a shared mode between the two areas, which makes sense because it's generated by this recurrency between the areas. There are other small differences in the third mode, but a big in PPC, but a big difference is that this third mode, which was originally in the feed-forward case, was aligned with the difference mode in PFC. Now in the recurrent case is aligned with the PFC sum mode. Okay, and so now this is just a pairwise comparison between two of these networks, but it turns out that there are really systematic differences between the residual dynamics, right, in these different settings, which are encouraging, right, because they might imply that we can actually use these measures to still distinguish between these different scenarios if we have access to recordings from both areas, right, from a larger part of the network. But this is, becoming very much feasible, right? This data is being collected. And so I think these measures really become only more useful the more data we have. And so this brings me to the end. So the hypothesis that we started with is this idea that the computation essentially is the same thing as the dynamics in these areas, right, like prefrontal cortex, like motor cortex. And I showed you that estimating recurrent dynamics, meaning computation, is really an ill-posed problem when the inputs into these areas are unknown, which is mostly the case, arguably, in experimental settings. And then nonetheless, we can differentiate between some models using the residual dynamics, right? So residual dynamics you can think of as perturbations away from the average trajectory, and it can distinguish between different computations. And specifically the residual dynamics in PFC during decision making and saccades rules out models that have been proposed in the past and that would have been consistent with the average trajectories, but are not consistent with the residual dynamics. And so also the comparison between M1 and PFC is one example of how the residual dynamics is well suited to compare local computations across different areas. Whether they're recorded separately or simultaneously, even better if they're recorded simultaneously. And the last point that I want to make is that what I said in the beginning, right? So now we have these very quantitative predictions, descriptions of residual dynamics, right? And if these are correct, right? So if this residual dynamics that we measure really maps onto the internal dynamics of these networks, then it means that we should be able to predict the consequence, for example, of a causal perturbation of the trajectory, right? This is what residual dynamics is, right? It's a description of the effects of a perturbation. Only we look at perturbation due to noise, but now the obvious next step is to look at causal perturbations. And I think then testing these kind of causal perturbations and or the consequences of causal perturbations and comparing them to the predictions that we can make with residual dynamics would be a very strong way of testing this whole framework of computation through dynamics. And with this, I'll finish. I want to thank the people that did the work, especially Anirudh Galgali, who was a PhD student in the lab and is now a postdoc. And all the data came from the lab of Bill Newsom. And Manish Sahani was a collaborator on the development of the analysis pipeline. And yeah, thank you for listening.
That was great. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was very, very interesting. We've got a few questions, and so I will invite Lawrence into the screen to ask the first question. Okay. Maybe I'll ask one question first while we wait for Lawrence. So, so you mentioned that, for example, you showed this. I think what happened to be a 6-dimensional system for this PFC, and then you said it's something like the first 10 principal components. So, if we, by doing dimensionality reduction, are we like, how can you be sure that we take into account all the relevant dynamics for this local linear estimation?
Yeah, so we do this. So we explicitly look for dimensions that where the residuals at one time have some predictive power onto the residual at the next time, right? So we do this using something that are called Hankel Matrices, right? So this is a construct from Subspace Identification, and it does exactly what we need, right? It gives us the subspace where variance at one time in the residuals is correlated to variance at the next time. It doesn't tell us what this correlation is, but it tells us there is some predictive power. And this space needs not correspond to dimensions that contain the largest variance in the condition averages, right? As I mentioned, right, there's some overlap, right? So these 6 dimensions that we measure, they're best aligned with, say, the 10 first principal components of the condition averages. But it's not the case that the 6 first principal components of the condition averages are also match the subspace of the dynamics that we define. So in that sense, if you want to be sure that you're looking at the subspace that contains dynamics in the residuals, then you have to focus on the residuals. Right?
Okay, thanks. Lawrence.
Thanks. That was a really beautiful talk, a really interesting set of ideas. So all of the analyses that you were performing, as I understood, were for mutar arrays, and I was wondering whether it's possible to do any of these kinds of analyses on pseudo populations where you might only have a residuals on like a subpopulation of neurons on each recording session.
Yeah, so I mean, you could not do it if you have single neurons, right? You just stitch those together. We have looked at some data that came from, not from mutar arrays, but from silicon probes, where the number of neurons maybe sometimes was only about 10 or 12. And yeah, I mean, you still can apply these methods, but you cannot really stitch together. Okay, so we do stitch together sessions in some way. So what we do is we essentially try to align. We do a first dimensionality reduction step that I didn't describe based on the condition averages, and we try to align sessions. Identify a subspace of the full state space such that the condition average trajectories within this subspace look the same across different sessions, and then we combine sessions, and we in this way can combine single trials across many sessions, right? Because effectively, when we compute the residuals, we're throwing out most of the variance in the data, right? So the condition averages explain a lot of variance, capture a lot of variance that is task related, and we're completely throwing that out, and we're only keeping the fluctuations along these condition averages, and so the signal to noise is pretty small, and you need a lot of trials. So I guess the answer is, if you have small number of neurons, it could still work, as long as, I guess, the dimensionality is low enough that you still get a snapshot of the dynamics in each of your experiments, right? So that you can actually recover some subspace that is common across different sessions.
I see.
But
so I guess like the dimensionality of the recording needs to exceed the dimensionality, at least of the task. And
exactly.
Yeah.
And another constraint, I guess, is the number of trials. So we have, just recently tried to do this analysis not on after stitching together many sessions, but just looking at a single session, and you tend to get lower dimensions, right? Smaller dimensionality, just because you don't have the statistical power to capture some dimensions that might be more quickly decaying, right? You tend to still be able to estimate the slow decaying dimensions, but the fast decaying dimensions, they might be outside now of the statistical power that you have.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
Okay. Next question is from Harrison. Is it?
Hi. Yeah, that was a wonderful talk. That was really fascinating work. The question I had, I think you might have answered a little bit in your response to the first question, but I'd love a little more detail. Is when you showed those eigenvalue traces, are those separate PCAs at different time points? And I'm wondering how you're aligning the eigenvectors across those different time points. I think you mentioned a little bit in the exact subspace that you're using, but I'm just
okay. So again, we have a first step where we want to combine different sessions, right? And so that is something where we use the condition average. So we just find a subspace, essentially using principal component analysis that is aligned across all sessions. And then within that subspace, and we now combine all the trials across sessions, we find this dynamic subspace, okay? Which is now fixed across the entire trial, okay? There is just one six-dimensional subspace that we're going to base our analysis on. But now at each time, we are going to estimate a different dynamics matrix. So yes, the eigenvectors could actually change from one time to the next. And in this particular case, we use some procedure to try to match eigenvalues based on how close the eigenvectors are from one time to the next, right? But it's really, so this is only important if you want to color these in a meaningful way. I'm not sure how much I would necessarily trust also these colors, because there is a problem that sometimes, right, so some of these eigenvalues can go from being real to being complex, and then it gets hard to actually track which eigenvalue at one time corresponds to another eigenvalue the next time. So it's not a super easy, it's not a simple problem, right? Here we only use this to color these traces essentially.
But that's kind of important. Like, how much does knowing that you're measuring the same trace throughout really inform the computations that you think are occurring in this population or set of populations?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we try to get at this then in different ways. So for example, we ask, what we can do, for example, is just look at the entire dynamics matrix, right? So this would be a 6x6 matrix here at one time, and then just compute the Frobenius norm with a matrix, the dynamics matrix, that we get another time, right? So we just look at differences in the matrix as a whole, rather than focusing on specific eigenvectors, right? And there it's pretty clear that there is not much changing, actually. It's not the case that the largest eigenvalue is constant, but the associated eigenvector is quickly rotating, right? That is something that you would see in terms of a change in these A matrices, and we don't see that, right? So the A matrix is essentially the dynamics matrix, pretty much constant here, and then it changes quickly around this time. Other ways we have to do, other things we can do is we can ask, we can take some reference direction.
Yeah.
For example, a choice direction, the direction allows you to discriminate choice best at some time, and we can ask, okay, to what extent does the slowest eigenvector align with this direction? And that kind of leads to a similar picture, that there's not much happening really in terms of the dynamics of the eigenvector is not changing around in a crazy way.
Or aligned to the eigenvector for like the midpoint of the trial or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Wonderful work. Thank you so much for sharing.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think it's 10:03. I think we'll wrap up here on Crowdcast, but we'll just continue chatting on Zoom together with Valerio. And I've just posted the Zoom link in the chat, so please feel free to come in and chat more informally. But for now, thank you very much. That was very exciting. And yeah, I hope everybody has a good weekend starting today, tomorrow. So thanks again, Valerio.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll leave it open for a bit so people can click on the Zoom. But that's it from us, I think.